If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sitting here writing this, I would have laughed in their face. Infidelity was something that happened to other people in failing marriages, people who ignored the warning signs, people who didn't know how to communicate. Not to me. Not to us. But the truth is, no one ever sees it coming until it's already too late. You spend years building a life with someone, trusting them with every part of who you are, and then one day, you realize that the person you thought you knew is a stranger. My wife, Laura, and I have been together for 10 years, married for 8. We met through mutual friends, hit it off right away, and fell into a relationship that felt easy and natural. She was smart, funny, and beautiful, the kind of woman who could light up a room without even trying. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but I always thought we had a solid foundation. Trust, honesty, and respect, those were the pillars of our marriage. Or at least, that's what I believed. Looking back now, I can see that the cracks started forming months before I ever suspected anything. At first, it was subtle: the late nights at work, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she started guarding her phone like it held the secrets of the universe. She used to leave it lying around the house, unlocked and unattended. But suddenly, it was always within reach, the screen tilted away from me, notifications silenced. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, people change. Maybe she was just going through a phase, trying to reclaim a sense of identity outside of our marriage. But the changes kept piling up. She started spending more time away from home, always with a perfectly reasonable excuse. Late meetings, dinner with friends, errands that seemed to take longer than they should. She became more distant, emotionally and physically. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly became strained and awkward. She stopped asking about my day, stopped sharing the little details of hers. And then there were the appointments. Laura had always been diligent about her health, but suddenly, she seemed to have an endless string of dental visits. At first, I didn't think much of it. She mentioned needing some work done: a filling, a cleaning, the usual maintenance. But as the weeks passed, the appointments became more frequent. Twice a month, sometimes more. I asked her if everything was okay, if she was having issues with her teeth, but she brushed me off with vague answers. "It's just a few follow-ups," she said. "Nothing to worry about." I wanted to believe her. I needed to believe her. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I started paying closer attention, looking for signs that I wasn't imagining things. And that's when I noticed the little inconsistencies: the appointments that didn't line up with her calendar, the times when she said she was at the dentist but came home without any signs of having had work done. Her explanations became more evasive, her patience thinner every time I asked a question. She accused me of being paranoid, of not trusting her, of trying to control her. And I started to wonder if maybe she was right. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was reading too much into things. But then, one night, everything changed. It was a Wednesday evening, and Laura had told me she had another late appointment. She left the house around 6, promising to be back by 8. I tried to focus on work, to distract myself from the unease that had settled in my chest. But as the hours passed, my anxiety grew. By 9 o'clock, she still wasn't home. I called her, but she didn't answer. I texted, but there was no response. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation: traffic, a delayed appointment, maybe she had stopped to run an errand on the way home. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. At 10 o'clock, she finally walked through the door. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly disheveled, and there was a faint hint of perfume that wasn't hers. She smiled when she saw me, but it didn't reach her eyes. I asked her where she had been, and her smile faltered. She hesitated just long enough for my heart to sink. Then she launched into a story about the appointment running late, about unexpected complications that had kept her longer than expected. But her words felt rehearsed, her tone too practiced. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the woman I had loved for the past decade wouldn't lie to my face. But the doubt had taken root, and I couldn't shake it. That night, as I lay beside her in bed, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing, I knew I couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And I was going to find out what it was. I woke up the next morning with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The air in the house felt heavier somehow, as if the weight of what I had begun to suspect had settled into the walls themselves. I moved through my morning routine on autopilot, my mind replaying every moment from the night before the late arrival, the disheveled hair, the faint trace of unfamiliar perfume. I told myself I was overthinking, that there had to be a logical explanation. But the doubt had already taken root, and no amount of rationalizing could make it go away. I watched Laura move around the kitchen as she prepared her coffee, her movements smooth and unhurried as if nothing was wrong. She glanced up and caught me looking at her, and for a moment, something passed between us, something unspoken but heavy with meaning. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask her again where she had really been the night before, but the words wouldn't come. I already knew what she would say. The same excuses, the same deflections. I had heard them all before. Instead, I waited until she left for work before I made my move. I knew I couldn't confront her without proof, real, undeniable proof that she couldn't explain away. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked into the bedroom and opened her nightstand drawer. Her phone charger was there, but the phone itself was gone. She never left it behind anymore. I moved to the closet, searching through the pockets of her coats and handbags, looking for anything that might confirm what I already suspected. Nothing. Just the usual items: lipstick, gum, receipts from grocery stores and coffee shops. I was about to give up when I noticed her laptop sitting on the desk. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it and powered it on. She had always been careful with her passwords, but I remembered seeing her type it in once, months ago, and my fingers moved almost on their own as I entered the code. The screen unlocked with a soft chime, and for a moment, I just sat there, staring at the home screen as the gravity of what I was about to do settled over me. I opened her email first, scrolling through the inbox with a growing sense of dread. Most of the messages were harmless work emails, newsletters, reminders for upcoming appointments. But then I saw a series of emails from a name I didn't recognize. The subject lines were vague, nothing that would raise suspicion at a glance. But as I opened the first message, my stomach dropped. The emails were from someone named Dr. Andrew Collins. The name didn't ring any bells, but as I read through the messages, it became clear who he was: her dentist. At first, the messages seemed professional enough: discussions about appointments, follow-ups, treatment plans. But the tone shifted as I scrolled further. The messages became more personal, more familiar, with inside jokes and references that had nothing to do with dental work. The timestamps told a story of their own late-night emails that had nothing to do with business, responses that came within minutes of each other, as if they had been waiting for the other to reply. My hands clenched into fists as I scrolled faster, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The further I went, the worse it got. There were messages that hinted at meetings outside of the office, references to seeing each other soon and looking forward to next time. And then, buried near the bottom of the inbox, I found the message that shattered any last hope I had clung to: last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about the way you looked when you smiled at me. Counting down the days until I can see you again. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the words in front of me. The air seemed to drain from the room, leaving me lightheaded and nauseous. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the sounds of the world outside. I felt like I was falling, the floor tilting beneath me as the reality of what I had just discovered settled over me like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. Cold, undeniable proof that the woman I had loved for the past decade had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And not with some random stranger, but with a man she had looked me in the eye and lied about, a man she had used as an excuse for her late nights and unexplained absences. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the screen with my heart hammering against my ribs. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to lose all meaning. All I knew was that when I finally stood up and closed the laptop, something inside me had shifted. The man I had been before I opened that email no longer existed. The trust, the love, the sense of security that had once defined my marriage, they were gone now, replaced by a hollow ache that I knew would never fully go away. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, my mind replaying the messages over and over again like a broken record. I couldn't eat. I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the image of Laura with another man, the laughter they must have shared, the stolen moments they had kept hidden from me, the lies she had told to cover her tracks. The woman I thought I knew had become a stranger, and no matter how much I tried to understand why she had done it, I couldn't find an answer that made sense. By the time Laura came home that evening, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to confront her right away. Not yet. I needed more than just emails. I needed something she couldn't explain away, something she couldn't twist into a misunderstanding. So I forced myself to smile when she walked through the door, pretending that everything was normal even as my heart ached with the weight of what I knew. She kissed me on the cheek, her lips warm against my skin, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. Every touch, every word felt like a lie, but I kept my composure. Because the next time she left the house, I was going to follow her, and this time, I would see the truth with my own eyes. The next few days were some of the longest of my life. Every moment spent under the same roof with Laura felt like living next to a ticking time bomb, waiting for the inevitable explosion that would tear everything apart. I watched her carefully, noting every glance at her phone, every vague excuse, every late-night dental appointment that stretched longer than it should. My mind cycled through the emails I had read, each message etched into my memory like a scar I couldn't erase. But as much as it hurt, I knew I needed more than words on a screen. I needed to see it for myself. On Friday evening, my opportunity came. Laura announced over dinner that she had another late appointment, casually mentioning it as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I forced myself to smile and nod, pretending to believe her even as my pulse quickened. She left the house around 6, dressed a little nicer than she normally would for a dental visit, nothing too obvious, but enough that I noticed. I waited 5 minutes, then grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept my distance as I drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I trailed her through the city streets. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the fear and anger that had been building inside me for weeks. I told myself that I needed to stay calm, that I couldn't afford to let emotions cloud my judgment. But the thought of what I might find made it almost impossible to breathe. She pulled into the parking lot of the dental office, a small, well-kept building on the edge of downtown. I parked a few spaces away, far enough that she wouldn't notice me but close enough to keep her in sight. I watched as she stepped out of the car, glancing around briefly before walking toward the building. Her posture was relaxed, her steps unhurried, as if she had nothing to hide. But I knew better. Minutes passed. The parking lot remained mostly empty, the faint hum of traffic from the nearby street the only sound breaking the silence. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe this was just a routine appointment after all. Maybe I had misread the emails, let my imagination turn innocent messages into something more sinister. But just as doubt began to creep in, the front door of the building opened again, and he stepped out. I recognized him immediately from the photo I had found attached to one of the emails, a man in his mid-40s, with sharp features and neatly styled hair, dressed in the crisp white coat of his profession. His gaze swept across the parking lot briefly, as if checking to make sure no one was watching. Then he turned and walked toward Laura's car. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him approach her window. She rolled it down, and they exchanged a few words too far away for me to hear, but close enough that I could see the smile that crossed her lips, the way her eyes lit up as she looked at him. The casual ease of their interaction sent a wave of nausea crashing over me. This wasn't the polite conversation of a doctor and patient. This was something else. Something more. I watched as he glanced over his shoulder, then leaned closer, resting one hand against the car door as if to steady himself. Their faces were inches apart now, their smiles fading into something more serious. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words, with the weight of something they both knew they shouldn't be doing. And then, without warning, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, a gesture so intimate, so familiar, that it shattered the last fragile hope I had been clinging to. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white, my breath coming in shallow gasps as anger and heartbreak collided inside me. Every part of me wanted to throw open the car door, to march across the parking lot and confront them right then and there. But I forced myself to stay still, to wait, to watch. I needed more than a glimpse. I needed undeniable proof. After a few moments, the man stepped back, glancing around the parking lot once more before heading toward his own car. Laura watched him go, her expression unreadable, before rolling up her window and pulling out of the parking lot. I waited until she was out of sight before following her, my mind a whirlwind of emotions: rage, disbelief, heartbreak, all tangled together in a knot that tightened with every mile. She didn't go home right away. Instead, she drove to a nearby cafe, parking at the far end of the lot where she could sit unnoticed. I watched from a distance as she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. I didn't need to see the messages to know who she was texting. I stayed there for nearly half an hour, watching her through the windshield as she scrolled through her phone, sipping from a cup of coffee she had picked up at the drive-thru. Her face was calm, relaxed, completely unaware that her carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down around her. Finally, she started the car and drove home. I followed her at a distance, my mind racing with everything I had seen. There was no more room for doubt. No more excuses. I had seen the truth with my own eyes, and there was no going back. When I pulled into the driveway and stepped out of the car, I knew that tonight would be the night I confronted her. The lies, the late nights, the secret messages, it was all going to come out, one way or another, and this time, there would be no escape. When I walked through the front door that night, the air inside the house felt different, thicker somehow, as if the walls themselves knew what was coming. I stood in the entryway for a moment, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floorboards as Laura moved around the kitchen. My heart pounded in my chest, every beat echoing the images burned into my mind: her smile as she looked at him, the way he had leaned against her car, the brush of his hand against her face. I clenched my fists at my sides, taking a deep breath to steady myself before stepping into the kitchen. Laura stood by the stove, stirring a pot of pasta as if this were just another ordinary night. The scent of garlic and tomatoes filled the air, but it did nothing to mask the bitterness rising in my throat. She glanced up as I entered, her smile warm but faintly distracted. "Hey, you're home early," she said, her voice casual, as if she hadn't just spent the evening with another man. I didn't respond. I just stood there, watching her, my mind replaying every lie she had told me over the past few months. Every late-night appointment, every excuse, every carefully constructed alibi. The words I needed to say burned in my throat, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't let anger cloud my judgment. I needed her to hear what I had to say, every word of it. She turned back to the stove, stirring the pasta with a slow, deliberate motion. "Dinner's almost ready," she said. "I thought we could watch a movie after. Maybe that new thriller you wanted to see." Her voice was light, almost too light, as if she were trying to fill the silence before it could settle too deeply between us. I took a step closer, my gaze fixed on her back. "Where were you tonight, Laura?" Her hand faltered, just for a moment, the spoon clinking softly against the side of the pot. She hesitated before answering, but when she did, her voice was smooth and practiced. "I told you I had a late appointment. It took longer than I expected." She glanced over her shoulder, her smile carefully in place, but I saw the flicker of something else in her eyes: caution, maybe even fear. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears. "At the dentist's office?" Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Yes. I had to get some follow-up work done." "Why?" I held her gaze, my hands trembling at my sides as I fought to keep my voice steady. Because I was there, Laura. I saw you. The color drained from her face so quickly that for a moment, I thought she might faint. Her lips parted slightly, her eyes wide with shock, but she said nothing. The spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering against the stovetop as she turned to face me fully. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice too sharp, too defensive. "I followed you tonight," I said, my throat tightening with every word. "I watched you pull into that parking lot. I saw him come outside to meet you. I saw the way you looked at each other." My voice broke, but I forced myself to continue. "I saw him touch your face." She took a step back as if the words had physically struck her. Her eyes darted toward the doorway, as if she were considering running, but there was nowhere to go. Not this time. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to regain control. "You had no right to follow me," she snapped, her voice laced with fury. "How dare you spy on me like that? Do you have any idea how invasive that is?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and hollow. "Don't turn this around on me, Laura. I wouldn't have needed to follow you if you hadn't been lying to me for months. I read the emails. I know what's been going on." Her breath caught in her throat, her chest rising and falling as if she couldn't get enough air. "You went through my emails," she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. "How could you invade my privacy like that?" "Because I knew something was wrong." My voice cracked as the anger and heartbreak I had been holding back finally broke free. "Because every time you looked me in the eye and told me you had a late appointment, you were lying. Every time you smiled at me, every time you kissed me goodnight, you were thinking about him. And I needed to know the truth." Tears welled in her eyes, but they did nothing to soften the sharp edges of her expression. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" My voice broke on the last word, raw with the weight of everything I had lost. "Why, Laura? What did he give you that I couldn't?" She looked away, her gaze unfocused as if searching for an answer she couldn't find. "I don't know," she said after a long moment. "I was unhappy. I felt invisible. He made me feel wanted again." The words hit harder than any physical blow ever could. I staggered back a step, the breath knocked from my lungs as the reality of what she had just admitted settled over me. All the late nights, all the lies, all the moments when I had wondered if I was imagining things, it had all been real. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice raw. "Did you ever think about what this would do to me? To us?" She met my gaze, her eyes hollow with guilt. "I thought I could keep it separate," she whispered. "I thought it wouldn't affect our marriage. But I was wrong. And I'm sorry." "Sorry?" The word tasted bitter on my tongue. "You're sorry because you got caught. If I hadn't followed you tonight, if I hadn't read those emails, you'd still be lying to me. You'd still be sneaking around behind my back." Her silence was all the confirmation I needed that I turned away, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in from all sides as the full weight of what had happened crashed over me. Everything we had built together, the years of love and laughter, the dreams we had shared, it was all gone now, reduced to nothing but ashes and broken promises. When I finally spoke, my voice was hollow. "I can't do this anymore, Laura." She stepped toward me, her hands outstretched as if she could somehow fix what she had broken. "Please," she begged. "We can work through this. We can go to counseling. I still love you." I shook my head, the tears burning in my eyes as I stepped back from her touch. "Love isn't supposed to hurt like this," I said quietly. "And I deserve better than someone who looks me in the eyes and lies." Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of her as the truth settled between us like a physical weight. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We just stood there, two strangers in the ruins of what had once been a marriage. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there with tears streaming down her face. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I sat in my car outside the house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My chest heaved with ragged breaths, the weight of the confrontation still pressing down on me. Every word, every tear, every moment of that conversation replayed in my mind on an endless loop. The look on Laura's face when she realized she had nowhere left to hide, the mixture of shock, guilt, and fear, it was burned into my memory. But beneath all of that, there had been something else, something that cut deeper than any of her words. There had been anger, not at herself. Not at what she had done. At me. I could still hear her voice echoing in my head, accusing me of invading her privacy, of spying on her, as if I were the one who had broken our vows. As if I had been the one sneaking around, lying to the person who had trusted me more than anyone else in the world. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. How could she stand there, tears in her eyes, and try to twist this into something that was somehow my fault? How could she expect me to just forgive and forget, to sweep her betrayal under the rug and pretend that nothing had changed? But something had changed, everything had. I took a deep breath and stared out at the darkened street, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound breaking the silence. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had, quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. But now, it felt different. The house behind me, the home where Laura and I had built our life together, no longer felt like home. It was just a building now, 4 walls and a roof that held nothing but memories of a life that had shattered beyond repair. I didn't know how long I sat there, lost in the tangle of my thoughts. Time seemed to stretch and warp, each minute dragging out longer than the last. Part of me wanted to drive away and never look back, to leave everything behind and start over somewhere far away, where the weight of what had happened couldn't follow me. But another part of me knew that I couldn't run from this. Not yet. There were still loose ends that needed to be tied. Eventually, I forced myself to move. My muscles ached from the tension that had settled into them, but I ignored the discomfort as I stepped out of the car and made my way back into the house. The air inside was heavy with silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock on the wall. I stood in the entryway, listening for any sign of Laura, but the house was still. Empty. I found her in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her head in her hands. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her fingers tangled in her hair as if she were trying to hold herself together by sheer force of will. For a moment, a flicker of something, sympathy, maybe, stirred in my chest. But it was quickly drowned out by the memory of her lies, of the emails and stolen moments, of the brush of another man's hand against her skin. She looked up when she heard me enter, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw with desperation. "Please, just talk to me." I crossed my arms over my chest, keeping my distance as I leaned against the doorway. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said." "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "We haven't. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I swear, it wasn't." "Don't," I cut her off, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't lie to me again. Not now. I read the emails, Laura. I saw you with him. I know exactly what happened. So don't stand there and insult me by pretending it wasn't what it was." Her face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she clutched at the fabric of her shirt like she could somehow hold the broken pieces of our life together. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was lonely. And he was there. He made me feel wanted." I finished for her, my voice hollow. "Yeah. You said that already." She flinched as if the words had physically struck her, but I didn't care. I was too tired, too broken to soften the edges of the truth. "You know what the worst part is?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "It's not just that you cheated. It's that you lied. Over and over again. You looked me in the eyes and told me there was nothing going on. You made me doubt myself. Made me think I was paranoid. All while you were sneaking around behind my back. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, and I hate myself for it. But please, we can fix this. We can go to counseling. We can— No, I said firmly, cutting her off before she could finish. We can't. Her eyes widened, her breath hitching in her throat as she stared at me like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Please, she whispered, taking a shaky step toward me. Don't do this. Don't throw everything away because of one mistake. One mistake? I repeated, my voice rising with the anger I could no longer hold back. This wasn't a mistake, Laura. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk at the grocery store. A mistake is missing an important date. What you did, what you chose to do, wasn't a mistake. It was a decision. Every time you sent him a message, every time you met up with him, every time you looked me in the eyes and lied, you made a decision. And now, you have to live with the consequences. Her knees seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank back onto the couch with a sob that shook her entire body. I stood there, watching her cry, feeling nothing but the cold, empty ache that had settled deep in my chest. I'll pack my things tomorrow, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. I'll stay at a hotel until I figure out what comes next. I'll have my lawyer reach out to you about the divorce. She looked up sharply, her eyes wide with shock. Divorce, she echoed, as if the word itself were unthinkable. No, no, please, don't do this. We can fix this. We can't, I said, my voice firm with finality. Because I don't trust you anymore. And without trust, there's nothing left to save. The air between us seemed to shatter with those words, leaving only silence in its wake. That I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. But as I stepped out of the room, something inside me shifted. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I spent the night in a cheap hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place where the walls were thin, and the air smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and old carpet. The bed was lumpy, the sheets scratchy against my skin, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that I was finally alone, away from the suffocating weight of the house where everything had fallen apart. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Laura's face, the tears in her eyes, the desperate way she had pleaded with me to stay. But beneath the sorrow, I couldn't forget the anger in her voice, the way she had tried to turn the blame back on me as if my search for the truth had been the real betrayal. The memories played on a loop, each one sharp and raw, until I finally gave up and stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the plaster as the hours crawled by. By morning, my decision hadn't changed. The weight of her lies still pressed heavily on my chest, but beneath the grief and anger, there was a growing sense of clarity. I knew I couldn't go back, not to her, not to the life we had built together. That life was gone, shattered beyond repair by the choices she had made. All that was left now was to pick up the pieces and figure out how to move forward. I checked out of the hotel just after sunrise, the early morning air cool against my skin as I stepped outside. The city was still waking up, the streets quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of birds perched on telephone wires. I stood beside my car for a moment, taking a deep breath and letting the crisp air fill my lungs before sliding behind the wheel and starting the engine. The drive back to the house felt surreal, as if I were moving through a world that no longer belonged to me. The familiar streets, the houses I had passed every day for years, they all looked the same, yet everything felt different. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a long moment, staring at the front door and gathering the strength to step inside one last time. The house was silent when I entered, the air heavy with the echoes of everything that had happened the night before. The faint smell of garlic and tomatoes still lingered from the dinner Laura had made, a bitter reminder of how quickly everything had unraveled. I moved through the rooms quickly, gathering my things with a numb efficiency that surprised me. Clothes, toiletries, a few personal belongings, the essentials of a life I was leaving behind. I didn't linger over the framed photos on the mantel or the souvenirs from trips we had taken together. Those memories belonged to a different version of myself, a man who had believed in a future that no longer existed. Laura was still asleep when I finished packing. I stood outside the bedroom door for a moment, my hand resting on the doorknob as I debated whether to wake her. But what was there left to say? I had spoken my truth the night before. There was no point in reopening wounds that would never heal. So I turned away, shouldered my bag, and walked out the front door without looking back. By the time I reached the end of the street, a strange sense of calm had settled over me. The anger and heartbreak were still there, simmering beneath the surface, but they no longer controlled me. I had made my choice. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. The next few days passed in a blur of paperwork and phone calls as I began the process of untangling my life from Laura's. My lawyer assured me that the divorce would be straightforward: no children, no shared business, no complicated assets. Still, the legal jargon and endless forms were exhausting, each signature a reminder of the promises we had once made and the future that would never come to pass. Laura called me several times during those first few days, her messages alternating between tearful apologies and angry accusations. I listened to a few of them before deleting the rest without bothering to press play. There was nothing she could say that would change what had happened. The trust between us had been shattered beyond repair, and no amount of words could piece it back together. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in late at night, when the silence of my empty apartment pressed heavily against my chest. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I had made the right choice. Could we have saved our marriage if I had been willing to forgive her? Could counseling have helped us rebuild what we had lost? But no matter how many times I turned those questions over in my mind, the answer was always the same: forgiveness might have been possible if she had come to me with the truth, if she had shown genuine remorse before I discovered her betrayal. But she hadn't. She had lied until the very end, until I had no choice but to confront her with the proof of her infidelity. And that was something I could never forget. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. I signed the papers in my lawyer's office, the ink drying on the last chapter of a story I had never wanted to write. As I stepped outside into the bright sunlight, I took a deep breath and let the weight of the past fall away. The future stretched out before me, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. Looking back now, I realized that Laura's betrayal, as painful as it was, taught me lessons I might never have learned otherwise. I learned that trust is the foundation of any relationship, and once it's broken, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. I learned that love alone isn't enough to sustain a marriage if honesty and respect are missing. And I learned that sometimes, the hardest choices are the ones that set you free. To anyone reading this who might be going through something similar, know this: the pain won't last forever. The betrayal won't define you. And one day, sooner than you think, you'll wake up and realize that you found peace not because you forgot what happened, but because you chose to move forward despite it. And sometimes, that's the greatest victory of all. Weeks turned into months, and the ache in my chest slowly began to fade. The memories of Laura and everything that had happened still lingered, but they no longer consumed me. Life moved on, as it always does. I found a new place to live, a small apartment with just enough space for me to start over. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a place untouched by lies and betrayal. Laura reached out a few more times, but I never responded. There was nothing left to say. The chapter we had shared was over, and I had no interest in reopening wounds that had finally begun to heal. Some might call that cold, but I saw it as self-preservation. Holding on to the past would only hold me back from the future I deserved. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights twinkle against the night sky, I realized something: I was okay. Not just surviving, but truly okay. The pain that had once felt unbearable was now a distant memory, a reminder of how far I had come. Sometimes, life doesn't go the way we expect. People change, promises break, and the future we imagine slips through our fingers. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that endings are often just the beginning of something new. And as I sat there, breathing in the cool night air, I knew that my story was far from over. It was only just beginning.